Welcome to Altea Talks, the brand new podcast series being brought to you by Altea, the unique provider of combined insurance and risk management solutions designed exclusively for the medical, allied health and care sectors. I'm going to be your host, Will Marshall, and I'll be joined in this series by some of the leading movers and shakers from across the sectors. My guests are going to include practitioners and professionals, regulators, clinical risk and governance specialists, and an array of legal experts who are going to help us get to the heart of the hottest topics affecting health and social care sectors today. So, if you're looking for frontline knowledge and expertise, if you want valued insights into these most dynamic, challenging and rewarding of sectors, then look no further because you're in the right place. Welcome again to Altea Talks. Hello and welcome to this latest episode of Altea Talks. In this episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Carlton Sadler, a leading partner at Bevan Britton LLP, who are one of the leading healthcare specialist law firms in the UK today. Carlton is a partner, as I say, at Bevan Britton's healthcare regulatory team. He's an experienced regulatory lawyer, having specialised in health and social care service regulation for over 20 years. In that role, Carlton advises providers, investors and funders in the independent health and social care sector on various aspects of regulatory law. His work covers contentious and non-contentious matters, including regulatory implications of business structures, the registration of services, advice on ongoing compliance, advice on regulators' powers, challenges to inspection findings, responses to civil and criminal enforcement action taken by the regulators, specialist healthcare due diligence in corporate transactions, and representation in public inquiries. Carlton has particular expertise in the regulation by the Care Quality Commission, CQC, having previously acted for many years for the regulators. Since the introduction of a national regulator in 2002, Carlton was the recognised legal advisor to the CQC in the mid-staff's public inquiry. In terms of his work for providers, Carlton has recently been involved in a high-profile challenge to CQC's single assessment framework. Carlton, thank you for joining and a very warm welcome to Altea Talks.
Thank you, Will. Good to be here.
You too. So in this episode, we're going to be focusing on all things CQC. And as listeners will know, the Care Quality Commission is the principal regulator of healthcare and adult social care in England. As at June 2024, there were almost 54,000 locations registered with CQC, including almost 30,000 care organisations. And it's fair to say CQC has rarely been away from the headlines over the past 18 months or so at least, having completed the rollout of its flagship new single assessment framework earlier this year. This had been launched to considerable fanfare the previous autumn. And I think really that's the starting point for us today, Carlton. And I think the first question I would like to ask you is, what was the single assessment framework intended to achieve? What were the drivers for the introduction of the single assessment framework? And how was it intended to differ from the previous inspection and assessment system?
Well, I think that there were probably a number of drivers for the framework when it was introduced. It was introduced off the back of CQC's strategy launched in 2021. And I think the drivers within that partly reflected a change which had already happened because of the ways of working through the pandemic, and partly to try to give CQC a mechanism to achieve what it wanted to achieve through its strategy, and partly because of changed ways of working. CQC has now got wider responsibilities to carry out assessments not only of registered services, but also of local authority and ICB commissioning. And it needed a tool to enable it to do that. The framework also provided a mechanism for picking up on some of the wider themes CQC wished to look at. So one of its themes of its strategy was around people and communities and putting people and communities at the heart of its regulation. And what that means for a lot of regulated services is that CQC is no longer looking at in isolation at what goes on within the regulated service, but about how that regulated service sits within and joins up with the communities around it with other services. And the framework provides a better mechanism for CQC to look at those aspects of care. And I think probably the final driver was CQC's desire to move towards what it called smarter regulation, which meant that it wanted a tool to enable it to be able to update ratings more often, and also in a way which enabled it to work and change ratings without necessarily having to carry out an on-site inspection.
Thank you. And what specific challenges was the single assessment framework designed to address?
In my view, one of the biggest real specific challenge, which has been massively felt by the sector, was out-of-date ratings. Because of the ways of working in the pandemic and the reduction in routine inspection activity, it meant that CQC adopted a very risk-based approach to where it inspected, and as a result, actually, the number of inspections tailed off massively. Now, that meant there was an awful lot of services left with very, very old ratings which are out of date. And I think even now, looking at the data as at June of this year, across the adult social care sector, there's around about 18,000 services which have got ratings awarded in 2022 or older. And that's even worse, I think, for those services who are stuck with requires improvement ratings, of which there's roughly about 2,000 who've got requires improvement ratings dating back from 2022. Now, if you bear in mind that CQC's processes when it introduced the rating bands was to return to requires improvement ratings within a year and check they've improved. That hasn't been happening. And it means there's an awful lot of services there who are stuck with a requires improvement rating, which may reflect what they were like 3-4 years ago. But actually, the nature of the risk may have been addressed very, very shortly after that, or even on the day of the inspection. And yet the service is left with that branding of performing below standards.
Yeah, and we'll come on to how important that is for these businesses, and also, of course, for the service users that they treat. And so there was clearly a need to move on to improve the inspection and assessment system. And the SAF, the Single Assessment Framework, was intended to, as I understand it, simplify the assessment process, be more insight-driven, and produce more frequent and sector-focused inspections. The rollout, as we know, was completed earlier this year. What's been the feedback? And in your experience, what have you heard by way of feedback from healthcare providers and care providers on how this new system is performing in practice?
Well, I think the feedback and the concerns which we had and which providers had and we heard of really started before the system was implemented. There was, as you'll know, there was quite a delay in the implementation of the system. It was meant to start in early 2023, and that was put back to the very back end of 2023. And that led to a pause in CQC's introduction. And when that pause ended, the information which CQC provided about how the system was going to work was very, very high level and didn't really provide the granular detail of how it would work, which providers required. And I think that was one of the concerning signs, is that although there was engagement about the system, it was, to say superficial is probably unfair, but it wasn't really getting into the details of it and how it would work. And those details only emerged at a very late stage, and in some cases actually only when the implementation started. So people, I think, were worried that they didn't quite know what to expect. And then when it did start happening, those concerns really came home to roost. As you mentioned, we were involved with a provider in bringing a challenge to some of those, to the framework and the way of working. And that challenge was prompted by the initial experience of how those assessments were working and the reports which were coming out. And there were really a number of concerns in that. So primarily, or one of the concerns was that lack of detailed indicators, a lack of detailed quality indicators. CQC scrapped a lot of the architecture under the previous Chloe's Key Lines of Inquiry regime. And that meant there was really not a great deal of guidance about what inspectors would be looking for when they inspected, and particularly how they were going to score what they found. The new system relies on each bit of evidence being scored as a 1, 2, 3 or 4, depending on whether it's 1 at the sort of significant shortfall end through to 4 being exceptionally good. And there's no guidance for inspectors or for providers to know how a particular piece of evidence should be scored, which box should it be put in. So that immediately brings a risk of inconsistency. But there was also probably the greater concern initially was about the scope of those assessments. They were so small in their scope, with only a very, very small number of quality statements being assessed, that meant there wasn't enough information going into the the mathematical scoring model to be able to change the dial from what it was previously at, which meant, I mentioned before, the services being stuck with requires improvement ratings would still be stuck with requires improvement ratings, even if what CQC actually saw was pretty good. There wouldn't be enough in the balance to tip that overall rating over to good. So there was a real concern about the rating system not reflecting the current standards and relying on old findings to supplement the gaps, and not being particularly transparent about the way in which they did that either. And that's in terms of the reporting. On a practical level, clients dealing with assessments and inspection and site visits expressed concerns about not knowing the focus of those assessments. Sometimes inspectors wouldn't even tell the clients which quality statements they were assessing. Sometimes the inspectors even, I've heard of a case when challenged that they said, actually, we don't know which ones we're assessing. And that's really, really difficult for providers to note. If providers don't know what they're being judged on, to know what evidence might be relevant to push towards the regulator.
Yeah, of course.
And the final real significant problem, logistical front, was the P word, the portal, which has been so problematic for providers, with difficulties in their staff getting the logins they need to be able to see things on the system, uncertainty about whether things have actually been uploaded. And that can take time, but it also can result in potential non-compliance for a provider if they need to notify CQC of certain incidents and they think they've notified via the portal, but that hasn't gone through. They could face some ramifications for that. And we've heard cases of providers having to sort of double submit and still send a paper copy as a backup, which is unsatisfactory and very time consuming. I guess
it's one thing if you've got a big team of people with the responsibility for that and the resources and so on. But if you're a relatively small entity, that must be causing have caused a huge amount of stress.
Absolutely. And it can take significant amounts of management time to try to get things on there and to make it work, and the stress and uncertainty of knowing whether it doesn't work. And obviously that time would be far better spent, on operational matters.
Yeah, taking people away from the front line. Yeah. So in the light of some of these concerns, thank you. We have the review by Dr. Penny Dash, and that, as I understand it, was commissioned was it in May 2024?
Yeah, a Cabinet Office review sort of commissioned on that basis.
Yeah, thank you. And in July, at the end of July, Dr. Dash published her interim report. And that, as we will go on to discuss, can fairly be described as a blistering report that was extremely critical of a number of aspects of CQC and particularly of the single assessment framework. And I think it would be really helpful if we could just delve into some of the specific issues and concerns that were identified in the interim report. But before we do that, it's worth emphasizing, isn't it, that this is just the interim report. We're still awaiting the final report from the Dash review.
That's right. And I think the interim report was only produced in the first place because the initial concerns on a quick look at things were really ringing alarm bells. And so it was felt important to get that out into the public domain and start the process of addressing those.
Can I just ask you, Carlton, what was your impression? Did you feel that the CQC were anticipating these kinds of criticisms when the report was commissioned? Because I think at the time, the CQC welcomed the review and was very keen for it to go ahead. But I just got the impression that the conclusions sort of rather took, maybe not CQC, but certainly Wes Streeting, the new health secretary, by surprise when they were published.
Firstly, I'd say that these Cabinet Office reviews are, they're not unique to CQC. They're carried out on all arm's length bodies, and in a sense, they're business as usual. So on the face of it, being subject to a review doesn't mean there's a problem. In CQC's case, obviously the review coincided with its introduction of the single assessment framework, in which, as we mentioned, there were a lot of problems. But in terms of CQC's state of preparedness for the outcome of that review, obviously I can't speak for them, but I think it was really interesting from our perspective to see that actually, in terms of the Dash Review's findings on the single assessment framework, they almost entirely coincided with the sorts of challenges we brought to CQC earlier on in the year. So those things were should have been very much in CQC's thinking at that point in time. And indeed, if you look at CQC's end-of-year reports in their corporate performance report for 2023-24, some of the risk ratings within that report touch on the issues about whether CQC was doing a good job in terms of providing information about the robust information about the quality and safety of services. And those risk reports showed that the risks was exceeding tolerance in terms of CQC's own risk reporting. So this shouldn't have come as any surprise, really.
Yeah, thank you. So if we just sort of have a look at some of the specific issues that are highlighted in the interim report, you've touched on some of these briefly, but the first concern or area of concern was around operational inefficiencies. And the interim report highlighted significant operational inefficiencies within CQC, including delays in re-inspections, backlogs in new provider registrations, and some of those issues that you've touched on. Can I just ask, how have those issues in your view, affected the transparency and effectiveness of CQC's role? And how have they impacted service users' ability to make informed decisions about care? Because I know that second part of that question was very much the sort of principal concern that was voiced by Wes Streeting, wasn't it, after these initial interim findings came to light?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's not CQC's sole purpose, but it's probably its biggest function is to provide information, to scrutinise, to measure services performance, and to provide information about that performance to the public. And it's essential that information that's put out there is robust, accurate, up to date. And because of the old delays and because of the way the new system was implemented, that was failing to deliver that. And that has an implication on all sorts of, or an impact on all sorts of people in terms of their decision making, whether that's people looking to place family members into care homes or to buy in home care, whether it's public sector commissioners deciding that which services to commission services from, whether it's lenders looking to lend money into businesses, investors looking to invest into businesses, etc. All of these people need a single, independent and reliable source of information about the quality of services. So those failures have a massive impact. That's talking about the inspection side of things. In terms of the registration delays, yet again, those have had an enormous impact, with the numbers of services waiting longer than CQC's sort of rough guideline time of 10 weeks to get their application processed. That rose from 22% of applications at the beginning of 2023-24 to 54% of applications. And that has a significant impact on businesses in terms of their business planning. They'll have had to incur build costs. They may be starting to employ some staff and incurring staffing costs, and yet can't begin to trade. And we've had a number of clients come to us raising concerns around that. But it also creates significant issues for the system. These services are there to provide additional capacity and to provide better facilities in local communities, in some cases to try to reduce out-of-area placements for particular type of services. And the delay in these services being open or being able to open has a real detrimental impact on the whole sector capacity.
Yeah. So that's very helpful. Thank you. And can I just move on? I'm going to mention the dreaded P word again now. So the report also highlights significant IT system failures in the provider portal and refers to issues such as the very slow document uploads, password resets, and causing delay and frustration. But I'd quite like to get your view on how these kinds of technical problems are impacting, in your experience, or have impacted providers' ability to focus on frontline care, which was something that you mentioned previously, and taking people away from that, particularly for the smaller organizations where they're maybe not so well resourced. And if you're able to comment on it, and again, obviously that may be something that is just not known at this stage, but what steps are you aware of that are being taken to address some of these IT challenges?
Well, goodness, I mean, anyone who knows me will laugh at the idea that I'm being asked a question about how to solve IT problems. So I'm probably the least able person to do that.
Well, me asking one, to be fair.
But I mean, the reality is I don't know what's being done within CQC to address these problems. But what I can say is to reiterate exactly what we said, that these IT problems which providers are facing are having, are not just frustrating, but they are having massive knock-on effects in terms of people's times. We've heard of a provider client who was challenging an inspection report, submitting a factual accuracy challenge via the portal process, and had to set aside half a day to upload the information. That's half a day's time, of a significant individual in the organisation, which could have been spent doing far more worthwhile stuff. I've mentioned the issues around uncertainties about whether statutory notifications, which people are required to submit, and it's an offence if you don't, uncertainty about whether they've been received and landed. And I think it also, and I really am sort of speculating a little bit here, but I think it does go both ways as well. I think some of the IT issues might be causing some problems at CQC's end as well, because amongst some of the other concerns we've mentioned, or in addition to some of the other concerns we've mentioned, there is increasing anecdotal evidence about delays in actually CQC getting the draft inspection report to providers. And it can be, there's always been an issue about that, but the timescale and the lag seems to be getting more worryingly long, which just increases the concerns for providers who say, actually, there may well have been some concerns at the time of the inspection, but that inspection was 4 or 5 months ago, and I'm only just getting the draft report. And now that's going to be published, giving me a rating on the basis of what was happening then, when actually I've long since addressed those concerns. So that delay in getting the reports out is only exacerbating the problem as well.
Of course, yeah, of course. And just moving on, the interim DASH report was particularly critical about the loss of sector-specific expertise within CQC, wasn't it? And some of the examples that were provided about inspectors lacking the necessary experience. I think I read in the report that there was the example of an inspector in a care home who'd never seen a patient with dementia before, a resident with dementia before. Really quite shocking. And it goes to the credibility of the organisation. And my question, I suppose, is how has this loss of expertise affected the credibility of inspection outcomes? And what can be done to restore trust and improve the quality of inspections?
Yeah, I think the lack of expertise has massively affected providers' trust and faith in CQC and the credibility of those inspection outcomes. This is nothing new. We've had cycles of regulators reorganising, and when CQC was first formed back in 2009, 2010, it pulled together an inspection workforce from its predecessors, the Care Standards, so the Commission for Social Care Inspection and the Healthcare Commission and the Mental Health Act Commission. And it combined them into what it called a field force model, where people were allocated an inspection caseload, which didn't necessarily reflect their own sector expertise. And that was criticised in the Mid-Staffordshire inquiry. And as a result of that, CQC moved towards setting up the individual inspectorates of adult social care, primary care and healthcare hospitals. And that led to a degree of specialism in the regulator. And that has been scrapped with the move towards the single assessment framework. But off the back of the DASH report, it appears that CQC are now recognising that need to do away with the generic inspector model. And they do seem to be recruiting, I think, for sector expertise again. So I think hopefully that will help to build some credibility. I think it's also important, not just the lack of expertise, but a little bit about their relationships with providers. It's getting harder for providers to maintain some engagement and relationship with CQC. That also seems to be recognised in response to the DASH interim report. I understand that CQC are doing some early work piloting improved relationships with NHS providers. It'll be interesting to see how, if at all, that reads across into its relationships with independent sector providers. But I think ultimately this issue about credibility will ultimately come down to the outputs in terms of what are the quality and robustness of the assessments and the reports which CQC produce.
Yeah, of course. And so moving on from that, I'd also like to ask you about transparency as well, because the report highlighted a number of specific concerns about the SAF, and particularly about the lack of clarity in defining what good or outstanding care looks like under that framework, and talked about that leading to inconsistency in assessments and missed opportunities for improvement. How can CQC better support providers in understanding what the inspectors are looking for, which seems a pretty key part of the process? and particularly across multi-site organisations. But I'd like to know your views on that.
Well, we touched on it earlier, really. I think the scrapping of the old system of the key lines of inquiries, which had a number of very detailed prompts below them, and I think totaled, if you added together the prompts and the key lines of inquiry, it sort of totals somewhere around about 335 different statements of information or statements of outcomes that CQC would be looking for. That's been replaced with 34 quality statements, so a tenth of the detail in the framework that there used to be. And that means there are gaps. People are going to have to make up those gaps as they go along. So there's very little guidance, or certainly no published guidance, for what inspectors should be looking for when they're assessing a particular quality statement. And that just means it's an inconsistency, it's inconvenient, it'll take more time. There's a danger that an inspector in inspecting one service will look for a particular suite of information and someone else elsewhere will look for something else. That's a problem in terms of inconsistency. It's a particular problem, as you say, for multi-site providers who maybe trying to put systems in place to manage the regulatory relationship and then find they can't have something that works everywhere. So I think in terms of how CQC address that, it seems that what they should do is to provide some more guidance for inspectors along those lines and for providers, but also some guidance for inspectors about how they should score evidence when they've received it. At the moment, we're helping a client with an inspection report at the moment, and you can look at some of the evidence categories, and the evidence CQC set out appears to be fine, doesn't identify any concerns, and yet they give it a score of 2, which suggests there is a shortfall in that evidence. It's hard to see where that shortfall is, but in the absence of any guidance for inspectors about what they should judge to be a 2 as opposed to a 3, you can see how these inconsistencies can arise. So there does seem to need to be some considerable more guidance issued by CQC, and I hate to say it, it's almost suggesting that we go back to the pre-single assessment framework architecture of having what we call ratings characteristics, that this is what good looks like, or this is what outstanding looks like for each key question. Now that means rewinding the clock and undoing a lot of what CQC has done in terms of implementing the single assessment framework, and is not an inconsiderable amount of work for them as well. And we'll have to wait and see quite how they tackle that and whether they do go down that route of issuing guidance on that basis.
Well, I mean, it certainly seemed to be the direction of travel, didn't it, in the interim report from Dr. Dash?
Absolutely, and CQC have sort of indicated they will do that, but quite how detailed that will be and whether it goes back to replicating what was in place before, I guess we'll have to see. And
thank you. It's interesting what you're saying about the need for better guidance, because the Dash report was also very critical, wasn't it, of the CQC's website guidance on the SAF, around the introduction of the SAF, and it described that as confusing, and not just to providers and to the public, but even, it seems, to members of the CQC's own executive team. Why was there so much confusion around that? And if you know the answer to this, and I appreciate this is something that is really a matter for the CQC, but it's like, how is CQC intending to improve the public and provider, and it seems its own understanding of the SAF?
I think, in my view, there's been quite an issue with CQC's guidance, not just on the website, but other bits of guidance for some time, in that I think they're probably very keen to write guidance in a way which is easily understood from a sort of plain language, use of language point of view. I think sometimes that can be at the cost of oversimplifying issues and lacking a bit of nuance where there needs to be nuance. I guess that's a view on the substance of that guidance. But I think probably quite a few of the criticisms are on the sort of more mundane issue about format almost, and the way in which it's physically presented on the website. I spend an awful lot of time reviewing CQC's guidance on the website, given my job, and it can always be quite hard to find your way back to a piece of guidance you've seen before, to navigate your way around the website. And that was one of the problems during the introduction of the single assessment framework. But also, understandably, CQC were frequently updating that guidance as they were developing the single assessment framework. So the guidance on the website would be changed very often, but it wouldn't be obvious or in any way flagged what had changed, or if anything had changed. So it could be quite difficult for providers and everyone working in the sector to know what the latest way of working was. And even down to very, very practical issues, such as, for a while, it was just quite difficult to download the guidance into a single place. You'd have a series of separate web pages and you'd have to keep flicking between them, and that can be quite tricky. I think in fairness to CQC, that side of thing has improved quite a bit, and it seems that you can now download guidance, and that does seem to be working. The other thing I'd just say about the website is obviously the way the reports are published, because, as I've mentioned, there's quite a reliance on old ratings in contributing scores towards the current assessment reports. Now, that is, there are concerns over that methodology, but it is the methodology it is at the moment. But even within that methodology, there were concerns that actually the fact of reliance on the old reports and the age of the old reports they were relying on was not made sufficiently clear on the website. So for members of the public, you wouldn't necessarily know that a rating had been arrived at, in quite a large part based on some findings which CQC may have made in an inspection which could have been 3, 4, 5, even 6 years old.
Yeah, that brings us neatly on to rating methodology, because the interim DASH report raised concerns about the transparency of the rating of the methodology, particularly the practice of aggregating inspection outcomes over multiple years that you've been talking about. Can you explain, please, a little bit about this approach and about the rating methodology? Because it is something that I know a lot of the people that I talk to, the providers that I'm talking to, struggle with, find it quite opaque. And then perhaps explain how the concerns around how this methodology is said to be affecting the credibility of some ratings, and what changes you think are necessary to move to a more transparent and accurate assessment process.
Yes, I'll give it a go. It's quite
okay. It's a big question. It's three questions.
It's sort of quite mathematical, unfortunately. So hopefully this will be understandable. But the problem is that under the single assessment framework, CQC follows a more granular and mathematical approach to arriving at ratings. So it starts building them up from a lower level. It awards scores to evidence categories within each quality statement, and those are sort of calculated up to give a score for each quality statement. And then under each key question, CQC will award a score for each quality statement, and those will be added up, calculated as a percentage of what the maximum could be, and then on a sort of grade boundary approach, that's then converted back into a rating for the key question. Now, that has some advantages, I think, in terms of more granular approach. It enables providers to know where they're performing badly at a more granular level and can address the issues. But what it does mean is that each quality statement carries a number and weighs equally in the balance when arriving at the rating for the key question it sits under. Now, that's fine, but the problems arose with the way in which the assessments were carried out because, as I've mentioned, not each quality statement was assessed, and in fact only a very small number of quality statements were actually assessed. So those which were assessed would be given a score based on that new up-to-date assessment, but all the others which weren't assessed would still be given a score based on what the rating was for that key question historically. Now, that means if you're not inspecting enough or assessing enough quality statements, it sort of becomes almost irrelevant how good or bad the findings are, because it's not going to change the overall numbers enough to change the percentage enough to move the dial between one rating or another, which is why there were issues with services being stuck with the rating they had historically based on historic findings. That's one of the issues. There was also a sort of related issue that actually even the score that CQC gave to historic findings may not have actually reflected all those historic findings. So to give you an example, under SAFE, for instance, one of the old key lines of inquiry and one of the new quality statements is around how services manage their medication. So it could have been, under an old style inspection, that there were a number of problems under SAFE, but medication wasn't one of them, and the service was performing well for medication. Under the old regime, that would result in just a single rating of, say, requires improvement for SAFE. And if CQC on the new single assessment framework didn't actually assess medication again, they would just look to the old rating and go, oh, okay, it's a requires improvement. We'll give medication a score of 2, which means shortfalls, even though actually what they found at the old time of the old inspection wasn't any shortfalls and was a totally satisfactory medication system. So it not only relies on old information, but it has the opportunity and the possibility that it might misrepresent that old information. So that was a major concern with the challenge to those reports. And following that, Ian Trenholm, the former chief executive, did make a commitment publicly that when assessing any services with ratings, key question ratings of inadequate or requires improvement, CQC would look at all the quality statements under those key questions which were inadequate or requires improvement. Now, that's incredibly helpful because it does give a chance to turn the dial if it's justified. What I would say is, despite that assurance, that doesn't always happen. So it's important for providers to try to make that happen if they can. So I think that's the problem, or largely the problem. How CQC changed that is really the sort of $64,000 question, because it seems to me that there are a number of ways they could solve that. They could solve it by assessing all the quality statements every time they set foot across the threshold, or even not across the threshold and decide to do a remote assessment. That would be a sort of return to the old style comprehensive inspections. Now, that has considerable resource implications, and I'm not aware that anyone is actually talking about that happening. So if that's not going to happen, then I think you've got a couple of options. One is you still carry out partial assessments, but you only score what you assess at that time, which means you won't be relying on old information to arrive at a rating. But it does mean that actually, depending on what you happen to look at, ratings could fluctuate at a service quite wildly between assessments. If CQC look at an area that's doing well on one assessment and then an area that's not doing so well the next time around. So there are advantages and disadvantages to that approach. The other approach is to say, well, okay, we will have a process that just looks at some quality statements on each assessment, but with some form of commitment from CQC that across a relatively manageable and reasonable period of time, it will look at all quality statements so that you'll know that it's not going to be relying on information that is massively old in reaching its overall rating.
That's going to have resource implications as well, isn't it?
That will have resource implications in the sense that it will require CQC to carry out assessments with a certain degree of frequency.
Yeah.
And interestingly, one of the pieces of information which hasn't been published about the single assessment framework yet and has been deferred by CQC is what will be their frequency of assessment.
Right. Is the intention for it to be more frequent, for assessments to be more frequent under the new framework?
Well, going back to where we started in the strategy for introducing the framework, that was one of the drivers that CQC acknowledged, that they needed to provide a more frequent and up-to-date ratings.
Yep. Yeah. Rather than these sort of big set piece inspections every few years. So thank you very much for that. That's absolutely fascinating. And we talked through some of the specific concerns that were raised by Dr. Dash in her interim report. And I'd just like now just to move on to some of the recommendations that she's made, because of course the report made various key recommendations around improving operational performance, fixing IT systems, rebuilding sector expertise within CQC. And it seemed to me that these are all pretty fundamental and very involved steps. With the full report expected later this year, maybe next month, what immediate steps are you aware of that are being taken to implement some of these recommendations? And what sort of impacts could they have on the future of the regulatory framework?
Well, I think in fairness to CQC, they have held up their hands and accepted the Dash report findings and have said that some of those were things they were already cognizant of and working to improve anyway. In terms of some of the practicalities of that, I think they say that they're continuing to work on the IT systems. Again, not my strong card to comment anything on that. But they are, as I mentioned, I think, trying to improve that whole piece about relationship management with providers and a piloting work on that. As far as I'm aware, that pilot work is focused at the moment more on relationships in the context of NHS services, but whether there's a sort of trickle-down effect into how they manage their relationships with independent sector providers, particularly, corporate providers with significant numbers of services, we'll have to wait and see. They seem to acknowledge that there has been a drop-off of the number of assessments, and they are intending to address that by increasing the number of assessments carried out. They also indicate that they're increasing the numbers of people working in the registration teams to try to help with that registration backlog. And I'm aware that they are working and holding workshops across with various stakeholders on their guidance to try to help some of those issues which are identified with the Dash report. So those are the sort of immediate steps which are going on. I think, in fairness, some of that will take some time to work through, but we'll have to await the output.
Thank you. And we know that Professor Sir Mike Richards has been appointed to review the assessment frameworks, but that's specifically with regards to NHS services, isn't it?
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, absolutely, in terms of how the SAF works for NHS trusts. Again, whether there will be any sort of read across from his findings in that sector to the impact on the independent sector, I don't know.
We'll have to wait and see. Yeah. So just thank you so much for providing us with your very informed and helpful views on the interim dash report and the single assessment framework. I'd just like to sort of move towards the end of this podcast now by taking a step back a bit and thinking about why this is important, why this all matters. And it would be really helpful, Carlton, if you could explain why, in your view, it's so important for trust to be rebuilt in a regulator, particularly a regulator who, according to the interim dash report, is deemed to be unable to consistently and effectively judge the quality of health and care services. And I'd like you to answer that question, if you wouldn't mind, firstly from the perspective of the service user, from the public's perspective, and secondly from the perspective of the registered providers.
Yes, well, I appreciate you're asking a regulatory lawyer to talk about the importance of regulations. So there's shades of turkeys trying to avoid Christmas here, maybe. But I think, in all honesty, health and care is an incredibly important service in our society. It performs massively important functions for some of the most vulnerable people in our society. So there's a real imperative that healthcare is delivered in a way which delivers high quality and safe services. And so it's essential that the regulator charged with guarding and overseeing that system functions properly. Its registrations are, an essential gateway into providing services, a test about services being able to operate if they are going to be delivering quality services. That's an important function. The registration function is essential, but regulation or the regulator mustn't be a blocker on that. And some of this backlog is acting as a blocker in terms of opening up new services to provide capacity to the system. So it's essential that is sorted. But in terms of its regulatory reporting and inspection function, CQC is the national regulator of health and social care services in England, and it has an opportunity to provide a single expert independent view on quality of services and a consistent view across all services in England which fall into its domain, which will be essential to inform all sorts of decisions by all sorts of stakeholders. So we mentioned the public. That's absolutely right. If there was a robust system of regulation, those reports could be extremely helpful to people wanting to make choices around what care services to access or what healthcare services to access. But it also, as I've mentioned, has a similar effect on the decision-making of other people with a part to play in the sector, whether that's the commissioners looking at the services they're buying, using public money to buy services, whether it's investors looking to move into the sector, wanting to know whether services are of good quality to invest in, and similarly with funders, lenders, bankers, and commercial landlords who want to keep an eye on the performance of the operators in their properties. So regulation has a vital part to play in informing all those people's choices and decisions around the sector, and it needs to be robust.
Oh, thank you so much. And of course, I should maybe conclude by saying it's of huge importance to insurers. I think in particular, the sort of key concern from insurers is that they'd be worried by the absence of clear definitions of what is considered to be good or outstanding care. And it's really the concern about there not being a consistent framework for evaluating that. And I'm sure you'll know the inspection assessment reports are an absolutely key metric to indemnity insurers working with independent sector providers who are registered in assessing the provider's liability risk, and it goes to the very heart of how that risk is priced, how the premium is calculated. And so I think it's absolutely critical for insurers, as well as the other stakeholders that you've mentioned, to have a regulator that is reliable, is transparent, and has credibility.
Absolutely. And as you say, consistency in the judgments it makes, and crucially, I think, up to date.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I think we'll leave it there, Carlton. I'm conscious of the time. It just remains for me to thank you again for agreeing to appear on the podcast. and for providing us with such an informative and fascinating analysis of the CQC and the interim dash report. And we'll see where we go when the final report is published in the next month or so.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Will.
Pleasure. Thank you for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Altair Talks. If you did, please don't forget to subscribe or leave a like or a review on whatever platform you're listening on, as this helps spread the word. If you have any questions or comments or topics you'd like us to explore in future episodes, please do contact us, as we'd love to hear from you. You can find us on LinkedIn or visit our website at www.altairinsurance.com. Stay tuned for more episodes, and until next time, take care of yourselves. The information contained in this podcast is not intended to represent a complete analysis of the topics presented. It is provided for information purposes only. The views expressed are personal to Carlton Sadler and Will Marshall, and do not necessarily represent the views of Bevan Britton LLP or Altair Insurance Limited. The content of this podcast is not intended as legal advice, and no responsibility can be accepted for any reliance placed upon it. Independent legal advice should always be obtained before applying any information to particular circumstances.